So first of all, who's a beaver?
Beavers.
And who's a duck? Some didn't raise their hands. It's okay for all the other weeks out of the year. This is Civil War week. If you live in Oregon, you have to pick a side. There is no neutrality. You're either a duck or a beaver. There is no in between.
So what if you went to Southern Oregon? Better known as Sauk. They have an identity.
I don't think there's anybody in the country that probably rivals that now. Even some of the big schools, Michigan State, can't be any more so.
You didn't really hate them, but you wanted to beat them, and you wanted to win those games. And it's pretty simple. You just don't lose. There's not enough room for two teams in the state.
It was just a great game and memorable because anything could have happened that day.
Winning that Civil War game was just the greatest feeling in the world. If you played well in the game the year before, everybody knew who you were. If you wanted to live in the state of Oregon, you better shine.
So this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I grew up in Eugene. Both my parents are Oregon alumni. I grew up essentially on campus, and you know me as your friendly neighborhood reporter on the Lake County Examiner, mostly covering high school sports, but my previous life before I came here was covering college sports. And I spent a lot of time, I was media credentialed to cover the University of Oregon, which is great being a fan and then being in the press booth box and getting to interview coaches afterwards. For years, I wrote for websites, I did historic research projects, and Yahoo.com a couple of years ago even did a front page feature on me where they called me the official, unofficial Oregon historian.
My ringtone is the Oregon fight song. My alarm clock is the Oregon fight song. So every single day, the first thing that goes through my head is Our Mighty Oregon.
Sometimes I just let it go to voicemail because I love the song so much.
There are all kinds of fans out there, but the best kind of fans are the loyal ones. Here's their story. Brought to you by Hyundai.
I'm Kurt Liedtke, and I'm an Oregon Duck. I've always been collecting stuff for as far back as I can remember, music and film and duck memorabilia. Over years and years, I've compiled a massive collection of historic University of Oregon footage. I've actually launched a website, campusaddict.com, where a lot of our focus is on University of Oregon history. We write articles, we do sit-down interviews with former players, we create videos to educate fans about some of the things that really makes the university unique. Both my parents are school teachers, so I grew up in an education household, and I take upon myself as much as humanly possible to educate fellow fans. The proudest thing that I've been able to discover is footage from the 1938 Idaho-Oregon game played at Hayward Field. I've been able to track down stuff about as far back as you will find film footage. In the 1970s, Oregon was at its absolute worst. Until 79, this JC quarterback showed up named Reggie Osborne. He's the only player in Oregon history who led the team in both rushing and passing in the same year. He was like a one-man team. He did everything. Every play was Reggie run left, Reggie run right, or Reggie run around in the backfield and avoid 5 tacklers and then throw it deep. The Alumni Association didn't know where he was. No one had talked to him in 25 years. I tracked him down. I did an interview with him. And then the university got in touch with me and said, we want to bring him back for an honorary captain. Last year, for the Oregon-Washington game, he was an honorary captain. I was up in the press box. And to have a legend like that, a legend of Oregon who's been forgotten and lost, to play a small part in being able to bring him back and have him be appreciated. Parents didn't know who he was. Most students had no idea about 1979 and 1980. But after the articles that we did about him and promote him, he got a standing ovation. People went crazy when Reggie was announced over the PA system. The year before that, he just would have been another guy back in Miami watching on TV. So many fourth quarter comebacks. The craziest game I personally ever attended was the 2000 Oregon-Arizona State game. The game was over. And I'm there with a buddy of mine who is from Phoenix, so of course he's an ASU fan. He's pulling on my shirt saying, dude, let's go, let's beat the rush, go get some food. I never leave the game until the clock hits zeros. I've sat through enough duck games to know you never leave, you never know what sort of crazy thing's going to happen. As I'm saying that, Arizona State fumbles. All they had to do was sit on the ball, and they fumble. Oregon gets it back, scores, sends it to overtime, sends it to double overtime. But that's the Ducks. In that era, every game was just a last-minute nail biter. if you grow up in Oregon, your college teams become your pro teams. You know, kids around the country, they might be in the backyard checking around a Nerf ball, pretending to be Tom Brady, or for us, we're pretending to be Dennis Dixon. I've been able to meet my heroes. When you put on an Oregon uniform, that means you fought for me, you fought for my community, you fought for my friends and family. It means everything. Anyone who ever put on a jersey. So the absolute least I can do is to say thank you by providing them some good memories.
Okay, sorry I could not combine that into my slideshow for some reason. I don't know why my computer is giving me problems. But it is officially Civil War week. 1 week from, or starting tomorrow, 1 week from tomorrow, will be the 119th time that Oregon and Oregon State played. They first started playing in 1894. There's been a couple years where they actually played twice in the same year. They did not play in 1901, 1900, 1910, and in 1944 and 1945, neither team fielded a team because of the war that was going on. In that time, there's been some incredible games. There's been some truly atrocious games. The teams have gone from being national championship calibers to being considered the worst teams in the country, and even talk about being kicked out of the league because they were so bad. Even though the games are fascinating, I think what's happened off the field between the two fan bases is really the unique story. And through all my research, I've been able to find some crazy stories from the past. I could talk about this for hours. I'm not going to because I know we have other places to be. But I wanted to share just some of the stories from the past, and also give some background, because going to games are fun, watching games are fun, being around fellow fans is fun, but being around opposing fans is the best. When you know more about their team than they do, you can shut them up so quick. So if nothing else tonight, I hope you can walk away knowing much more about Oregon and Oregon State than you ever thought that you would know. So, Oregon and Oregon State, the two major schools that represent the state of Oregon. They're only 40 miles apart. In this massive state, Oregon, in terms of square miles, is one of the largest states in the entire country. Yet the two schools are side by side, but they could not be more polar opposites in terms of their cultures. Oregon State was based on an agricultural school, kind of conservative and rural in nature. University of Oregon, very liberal, progressive, metropolitan. It's oil and water, and they're right next door to each other. You know, when you have something that close that's that different, there's going to be a lot of friction. And yet there's a lot of overlap too. It spans family ties. So just as an example, this is Kenny Wheat, Oregon Duck legend, good friend of mine. In 1994, he made a play that is still, before every single game, when Oregon runs out on the field, they show his play against Washington in 1994 on the big screen before the team runs out of the tunnel. And here's Marcus Wheaton. Last name sounds kind of familiar. He now plays with the Pittsburgh Steelers, but he was one of Oregon State's all-time greatest receivers, and he was Kenny Wheaton's cousin. Then, of course, there's my friend Rory Derry, who was a team captain safety for Oregon in the 1980s. And his daughter, an Oregon State cheerleader currently. There's TJ Ward, who plays for the Denver Broncos now, and his brother, Teron Ward, who plays for the Atlanta Falcons. And then there's the Linehan family, native Oregonians. Their cousin Scott actually coached the St. Louis Rams for a while, so a football family. Josh Linehan and Cole Linehan decided to pick opposite sides, and Josh was an offensive lineman for the Beavers. Cole was a defensive lineman for the Ducks, which meant not only were they on opposite teams, they lined up opposite each other and hit each other on every single play for 2 years. Both schools have had some incredible firsts. Academically, in terms of events that have happened, athletically. A few that I wanted to highlight, this gentleman right up here, Bobby Robinson. And one of the sad aspects of Oregon history, you may know about the Exclusion Act. In the early 1920s, Oregon was actually one of the epicenters of the KKK. And there was a lot of racism problems here. The Exclusion Act made it illegal for any blacks to live in Oregon cities up until it was overturned in 1926. 1926 happened to coincide when this gentleman, Bobby Robinson, along with another black player named Charles Williams, became the first two African-American football players at the University of Oregon. Now, Bobby Robinson in particular is very important because his position was quarterback. He is the very first black quarterback at a major college university in the entire country, at the University of Oregon. A couple of decades later, this gentleman down here, Woodley Lewis, would become the very first black player drafted into the NFL in 1950. He was an Oregon Duck as well. Everyone knows National Lampoon's Animal House, one of the greatest comedy films of all time, filmed at the University of Oregon. But actually, there's been over 10 major motion pictures filmed at the University of Oregon, including the very first student film that was ever made was a silent film called Ed's Co-Ed, made by University of Oregon students. That I could do a whole lecture on just by itself. Really fascinating story there. Over at Oregon State, of course, everyone knows Terry Baker. If you're a Beaver, you know all about Terry Baker. Won the Heisman Trophy in 1962. That same year, he was also named the Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year. He was the first person in history to win both awards in the same year. He was also the very first West Coast player to ever win the Heisman Trophy award. Dick Fosbury in 1968 won the gold medal, invented a method of doing the high jump that completely revolutionized the sport. Prior to the Fosbury flop, as it became known, people would try to scissor kick over the bar. And this guy showed up and everyone said, what the heck is that? But he was out clearing people by over a foot more than everyone else. So he said, hey, it works, try it. Oregon State is also kind of interesting in that it was established as a public land grant. And it is now the only public university in the country that is a land grant, sea grant, space grant, and sun grant. All four, it covers the bases.
What was the last one, sun?
Yep, sun, space, sea, and land. So there are some Lake County ties. Plenty of people from Lake County have gone on to be Ducks and Beavers. Many have returned, and some have done quite noteworthy things. Lakeview's own Gene, I'm sure everyone knows the story of Gene, won a gold medal in the 1964 Olympics, and Oregon State University graduate. A couple that are currently from here, Tess O'Leary from Paisley. She was a stand-up basketball player, track and field athlete, volleyball player at Paisley. When she got to Oregon State, she knew she still wanted to compete in sports, but wanted to try something different. So she decided to join the rowing team. There's not a lot of opportunities in Lake County to try out, but she decided to give it a try. And her freshman year, she ended up joining the varsity team, which is pretty rare. In the last 2 years, Tess and her teammates have pushed Oregon State into the top 10 in rowing, and they've been in the running for the national championship for the last 2 years. On top of that, she's an academic All-American. Then, of course, Christian Roseberry, originally from Bly, and graduate from Lakeview High School. He is now a walk-on running back at the University of Oregon.
I think his name's Lane.
So
Lane, the brother?
His brother is now at George Fox University, and he has a sister that's currently a junior at Lakeview High School as well. Christian is a fascinating story. Now, he hasn't had a chance to play in games very much. He's a walk-on. He's a sixth string at a position where Oregon has a lot of depth. But he is one of the most fascinating people on the team in that he's blown out his knee twice. He's torn his ACL twice. Both times he's come back from that injury stronger, faster than ever. He is the single most inspirational player on the team. They named him a squad leader, which every position has a player that they appoint as the person who's going to go and talk to the coaches if there's a problem. He was also named a team captain. He is the squad leader for the running backs and the team captain as a walk-on and at the bottom of the depth chart. Myself and others at the University of Oregon that I know, we've tried to research this all over, and we have not found a single example, past or present, in all of college football history when a walk-on was named the team captain, except for Christian Roseberry. But when it comes to Lake County athletes, this guy right here takes the cake. Now, if you've read the Lake County Examiner in the past year, you might have read an article I wrote about a gentleman named Ross Carter. This is the 1928 Lakeview High School football team. It was the very first year that Lakeview had a football team. They scored 1 touchdown that year. It took 2 years before they actually won a game. But Ross, in 1928, after football was over, he helped lead Lakeview as the basketball team captain to the state playoffs. And then when he was a senior, the football coach decided to start a track and field program. So 1931, his senior year, was the first time that Lakeview High School had a track and field program. He tried discus, javelin, and shot put and qualified for the state championship in all 3 categories his senior year. He decided to go off to Southern Oregon University and played 1 year under a gentleman named Howard Hobson, who after 1 season decided to take a job at the University of Oregon. And Ross Carter followed him to Oregon thinking he was going to play under his coach. Well, Hobson instead ended up coaching baseball and basketball. In 1939, he led Oregon to the very first NCAA national championship, beating Ohio State. The guy that ended up being hired for the football coaching job instead was a gentleman named Frank Callison. I'll get back to print in just a second. But Ross, even though he played only 1 year at Southern Oregon University, he's in the Southern Oregon University Hall of Fame. He played 2 years at University of Oregon. He's in the University of Oregon Hall of Fame. 1991, he was named to the all-time Oregon football team. As an offensive lineman, he played 4 years in the NFL. He was named an All-Pro in the NFL before he decided to retire, come back to Oregon. Ran a lumber business, a very successful one in Eugene for 40 years. His oldest son played football for the Ducks in the 60s. His middle son was a track and field athlete in the 70s. And when he retired from the lumber industry, his son, who was a track and field athlete, said, "Dad, you need a hobby. Why don't you try track and field?" So he picked up a javelin and a shot put and discus, just like he had in high school here in Lakeview. And for the next several decades until his death, he traveled the world winning every gold medal at every senior Olympic event imaginable. He set 6 world records for his age bracket, 3 of which still stand to this day. And he is the oldest athlete ever named the track and field athlete of the year. That's him competing at age 70, setting 6 world records at the Masters shot put. Here's an article I found in the Lake County Examiner about Shovel Nose, was his nickname. Shovel Nose Carter. University of Oregon had just played a game at St. Mary's in San Francisco, and he decided to take the scenic route, and they came back to Lakeview one day, and they held a big luncheon for him in his honor. And then there was Frank Callison, the coach who coached Ross Carter his first couple of years. As soon as Ross Carter left the NFL, Frank Callison decided to make a trip to Lakeview. And they held a big ceremony in his honor. The school band played, they held a big luncheon. Now, he thought it was a goodwill thing, or everyone thought it was a goodwill thing because Ross Carter came there. Frank was no dummy. He realized he just had the best player in program history come from this little town called Lakeview out in the middle of nowhere. He wanted to know if there were any other kids like Ross Carter that he could recruit, and he wanted to catch him before the Beavers got him. So, Oregon State University. I won't go through all of this because otherwise we'll be here for hours on that. But its roots started in 1851, back when Corvallis was called Marysville. And it was decided that Marysville would be the site of a territorial university, the first university in the territory of Oregon. Marysville actually, for a short time, was the state capital. Well, I shouldn't say state capital, it was territory capital. And then in 1857, this building was built. That is Corvallis Academy, later known as Corvallis College. Oregon State has changed its name a bunch of times. So it's gone under different names. Corvallis Academy, Corvallis College. This gentleman right up here, standing on the roof, that's the first principal and teacher at Corvallis Academy. His name is J.W. Johnson. We'll get back to him in just a minute. But eventually, a board of trustees was established for it, and the school was bought by a Methodist church. And in 1868, it was reincorporated and chartered as the Agricultural College of the state of Oregon. That is when Oregon State University was founded, 1868. Now, it's kind of interesting because if you talk to Duck fans a lot, they like to use the nickname Little Brother to talk about Oregon State. They're trying to belittle Oregon State. You know, and it's the little brother. They're just going to do their thing. Don't worry about it. It's kind of weird to call Oregon State that because Oregon State is older than the University of Oregon, and it has a larger enrollment year after year by several thousand students. So older and bigger, and yet Oregon fans call them Little Brother, right? I think that's kind of wrong. The name changed more throughout the years. It became Corvallis College, State Agricultural College. For a long time, it was known as Oregon Agricultural College, OAC, and the nickname was actually the Aggies. Agricultural Aggies, not the Beavers. Oregon Agricultural College. 1893 was when they established that name. Bennett Hall was built in 1889. The first time they played a football game was 1893. They beat Albany College 62-0. Now, as for the University of Oregon, 1854 is where its roots are. What's kind of interesting, and one of the things lost to history, is the fact that the University of Oregon was not the first college in Eugene. That was Columbia College, built in 1854 is when they started fundraising for it. 1856 was when it was built, shortly burned down immediately after that. So they rebuilt it again, a second wood building, which a year later burned down again. Kind of like the story of the Three Little Pigs. They rebuilt it the third time and decided to do it out of brick this time. So that one didn't burn down, but they never actually finished it. At that point, there was a lot of internal squabbles, and there ended up being a lawsuit, and the school ended up going bankrupt. They disassembled the building, and it was used to construct other buildings around the area. Now, for anyone who spent a lot of time in Eugene, you know there's a part of Eugene called College Hill. You may wonder why it's called College Hill, because it's miles away from the University of Oregon. Well, the reason why is because College Hill was where Columbia College was located. So, fast forward about 12 years later, and the Oregon State Legislature decided that they needed a public university. It was actually a requirement from Washington, D.C. that a public university, Oregon State had been established as a land-grant university, the state also needed a public university. So they began fundraising for what would be Oregon College. And Eugene City, as it was known at the time, was the place that it was decided was going to be. So Dee Hall, right here, this is the first day of classes in 1876 in October. And that building continued to be under construction during the entire first year of classes. So students were taking classes in the other room, there'd be hammers pounding, and they're still trying to build walls. It's interesting that Oregon State is thought of as the agricultural school because the University of Oregon was quite literally built on livestock. Because this building, even though they started construction, they hadn't fully fundraised for it yet. So the University of Oregon was funded through donations from local farmers, donating cows, chickens, goats that would then be sold at market, and those funds would go towards construction of Dee Hall. The campus ran into more financial problems early on, and in 1881 it almost closed for financial reasons until a railroad tycoon named Henry Villard decided to cut a check for $7,000 to keep the school open. So 4 years later, when they built the second building for the university, they called it Villard Hall. Dee Hall and Villard Hall both still stand on campus to this day. They're still both used. The third building is one that's far less known, and that was an astronomical observatory that was built on top of Skinner's Butte. Skinner's Butte, the person who founded Eugene was named Eugene Skinner. In the 1840s, he built a cabin and a post office, and he built it at the bottom of this hill that became known as Skinner's Butte. And Skinner's Butte has been the epicenter, really, and we'll get to this later on, of the fight between Oregon and Oregon State fans. But it began with an observatory that they built on top of the hill. Problem was, Skinner's Butte is several miles away from Dee Hall, so students had to travel a long ways to get over there. Plus, it's the Willamette Valley. It rains every single day, so you can open up the top to look at the sky, and all you're doing is looking at clouds. So the building, eventually they abandoned it. It became a place for vagrants, and in 1905, the school president told the maintenance person, I'm blanking on his name right now, sell the building, get rid of the building at no expense to the university, whatever you want to do, we just don't want it to be there anymore. So he said, okay, and the next morning he took a big package of dynamite and blew the building sky high. And it certainly left a mark. It woke up the entire town. And students later came out that afternoon and set up a second explosion to finish it off and then cleaned it up. Several years later, students would then take some of that debris of the foundation and build a gigantic O on top of Skinner's Butte. And we will get back to the O in a little bit. That is a story that deserves its own place in history. Oregon State played its first game in 1893. University of Oregon played its first game in 1894. They played the same school. Those schools played Albany College. Remember, Oregon State beat Albany College 62-0. Oregon beat Albany College 44-0. So chalk went up for Oregon State. It was a better team at the time. In 1913 and in 1932, in both times, Oregon was experiencing a major budget crisis. And it was decided that a ballot measure would be pushed through across the state that these two schools would merge. Now, people voted that down. It's okay to be a duck and a beaver, but no one wants to be a platypus. So the ballot measure failed, and as a result, there were some changes that came into play. But it's interesting to note that twice in history they've tried to combine Oregon and Oregon State together. So how exactly did Oregon State become the Beavers? Well, you can thank this guy right up here, Kenny Austin. 1952 is when he became the very first Benny Beaver. But way before that, 1892 is when Oregon State had its first mascot. And it wasn't a beaver, it was a coyote. A live coyote that they named Jimmy. Now, Jimmy was only around for a year or two before they got smart. They decided, let's have a human mascot. So the second mascot for the Oregon State University was the local Presbyterian minister. His name was John Richard Newman. And his whole shtick was that when Oregon State won a game, he would lead a parade over to Mary's River and throw his hat into the water. So he was the mascot for a while. Early 1900s, people started referring to the team as the Beavers, even though it wasn't until 1909 that Oregon officially became the Beaver State. But more commonly, the school is known as the Aggies, and sometimes they were called the Orangemen as well. In the 1930s, some students captured a live beaver, and they started bringing that beaver to games as the unofficial mascot. But that was Billy the Beaver. That wasn't Benny the Beaver. You have to go to 1952 with this guy. And how Oregon State became the Beavers is actually over here with the cheerleaders the Yell King, Bill Sundstrom. Kenny and Bill were fraternity brothers, and Bill had just been elected as Yell King for Oregon State University. Part of the reason why he won was he promised the school administration that they would establish a student mascot. So he came back to the fraternity house and said, hey, Kenny, guess what? You're the school mascot now. So they had some beers and sitting around thinking, what are they going to call him? And they decided, well, Kenny, let's call him Benny. Kenny and Benny. So his alter ego became Benny Beaver. So the reason why you have Benny the Beaver is because this guy's name just happened to be Ken. So he built the first costume himself. He took a shag rug from the fraternity and cut it all up and made his own costume. So that's the fraternity rug there. That's his head. A gigantic sponge became his tail, and it evolved over time in the 60s, and in the 80s they added the second mascot. Bernice joined Benny, and for about 15 years, Bernice roamed the sidelines alongside with Benny. Now, how Oregon became the Ducks is a bit more complicated. It actually goes back to the American Revolutionary War. Now, the duck wasn't actually there with George Washington, obviously, but crossing the Delaware River in 1776, the precursor to the Battle of Trenton, which was one of the key victories early on in the war that allowed George Washington to eventually win the American Revolutionary War. His army crossed under cover of darkness the frozen Delaware River, taking boats to attack Trenton the following morning. And the group of fishermen that manned those boats was a group of New England fishermen that were known as Webfoots. And they became known as the Webfoot Brigade. And throughout the entire war, they were known as the Webfoot Brigade. Now, after the war, some of the members of the Webfoot Brigade, as well as their descendants, were some of the first people that settled in the state of Oregon. And that nickname came with them. In the same way that people from Indiana are known as Hoosiers, people from North Carolina are known as Tar Heels. That name stuck. And anyone who was from the state of Oregon was known as a Webfoot. So it made natural sense that early on, the University of Oregon would be called the Webfoots. The first yearbook was called the Webfoot. For a short time, it was actually called the Beaver, and then once Oregon State decided that they were going to be the Beavers, that wasn't okay, so they changed it over. But Oregon was known as the Webfoots for years, and it wasn't until the 1920s that they had their first mascot. This is Puddles the Duck. And what happened is Eugene has something called the Mill Race, which is a man-made water stream that breaks off from the Willamette River, and it runs all through campus and through downtown Eugene, and it runs right by the fraternity houses. And some fraternity brothers found a duck that had been injured, and they decided to nurse it back to health, and they started bringing that duck to football games and basketball games. And they nicknamed it Puddles the Duck. And for decades, Puddles and other ducks named Puddles would roam the Oregon sidelines during games. Now, being the Webfoots, and as a sports reporter, I can attest to this, you're always trying to make things short and concise to fit into a newspaper. And so some writers in the mid-1920s decided to start using the term ducks instead of Webfoots. They thought it was the same basic thing, but ducks is shorter for Webfoots. That's the only reason why the University of Oregon is called Ducks, is because it was shorter to write than Webfoots. So in 1932, they put up a student vote and decided what should the official name of the school be. They'd been calling themselves Webfoots, but should we stay with Webfoots? Some of the names they suggested were Pioneers, Yellow Jackets, Trappers, and the interesting one is Spearsmen. And this is a clipping from the Lake County Examiner. When C.W. Spears was hired as the new football coach of the University of Oregon, they decided, let's name the entire school after the football coach. Well, the problem is, C.W. Spears, he signed a 5-year contract, and he only left after 2 years. Imagine if the University of Oregon was still called Spearsman to this day, and no one had a clue who C.W. Spears was. So, Webfoots overwhelmingly won the vote. So they stayed as the University of Oregon Webfoots. So that was all well and good until the 1940s. There were some Humane Society folks that didn't like the idea of a live duck being captured and being held. So they wanted to have a mascot costume instead. Well, Leo Harris, the athletic director of the university, just happened to be friends with Walt Disney. And so he and some other people from the University of Oregon in 1947 flew down to Los Angeles, and they established a handshake agreement with Walt Disney saying, can we use Donald Duck's likeness as our mascot instead of using Puddles the Duck? And Walt Disney agreed to that. So here's the very first, it doesn't look like Donald to me, but that's the very first costume. And it evolved over time. This one's downright creepy right here. That kind of scares me a little bit. But you can see the slow evolution into the duck that we know today. Now, Puddles was still used at times. Puddles the Duck was actually taken care of by Oregon State students, not University of Oregon students. So here's the Oregon State cheer team returning Puddles to the University of Oregon. Puddles lived in Corvallis, agricultural school, so they would bring him back when Oregon needed him. But the Oregon mascot was held in Corvallis at Oregon State. Now, that was all well and good to have the duck until the 1970s. And in the 70s, Oregon had a great basketball team. That was the big draw. Football wasn't the draw. Basketball was incredible. The problem was the coach, Dick Harder, hated the duck. Hated the duck. He thought it was the worst nickname ever. The football coach didn't like it either. Jerry Fry, he thought that the duck should have fangs, that it should be more fierce. But Dick Harder didn't want ducks to be mentioned in any of the articles. He demanded that sports writers come up with an alternative term. So his teams were known as the Kamikaze Kids. That's a term that's still kind of known to this day. He didn't like the duck mascot either, so they created a new one, Mallard Drake. Now, in the 1970s, a mascot not based on Donald Duck, but based on Daffy Duck became the mascot. So Mallard Drake was the mascot in the 70s. Until Dick Harder left in 1978, they had another student vote. Are we going to keep Mallard Drake, or are we going to go back to the duck? And students said, give us back our duck! We hate Mallard Drake! Give us back the duck! So they brought back the duck. And that was all well and good. Everyone loved the duck. The problem was the Disney agreement. See, they had the rights to have the likeness for the duck, but the agreement was only based on they could only market the duck in the state of Oregon. The duck couldn't appear on TV outside of the state of Oregon. So they couldn't market it, they couldn't use its logo in any way. They were really hindered. So in the early 2000s, when Oregon started getting really good at football and they wanted to establish this whole marketing campaign, they decided to come up with a new mascot. So in 2002, they brought out Robo-Duck. Broke out from a shell during the halftime ceremony. Immediately, the whole stadium booed, threw garbage. Everyone hated Robo-Duck. Hated him. And so he lasted less than a year. Robo-Duck was unceremoniously retired after a halftime basketball slam dunk contest between him and the duck, but the duck won. At that point, they said, enough with Robo-Duck, he's out of here. But just know, anytime, sometimes you'll hear TV broadcasters say Puddles, sometimes you'll hear fans say Puddles, just know, he is the duck, he is not Puddles. Puddles was the live duck from 1920. So, as I mentioned, there's a lot of family ties that go back and forth between Oregon and Oregon State. But one of them is J.W. Johnson, the guy that I mentioned before that was the first principal and teacher at Corvallis Academy in the 1850s. He was the first president of the University of Oregon. So he went from Oregon State to Oregon. Now, in the early 20th century as well, amidst that budget crisis I talked about, 1913, when they talked about combining the two schools, when that failed, the alternative was that some of the programs that the University of Oregon had, they had to give up. So they moved the engineering program from the University of Oregon to Oregon State. And it still to this day is an Oregon State engineering program. Now, the Oregon State engineering program is considered one of the best in the entire country. But it's the University of Oregon's program. That's where it was established. The University of Oregon to this day technically does not have an engineering program. It started at the University of Oregon. They also moved the normal school, which was established at the university. That later became Linfield College. After 1913, it was moved out. 1908 London Olympics. This gentleman on the left is Forrest Smithson, Oregon State. This gentleman is Dan Kelly, University of Oregon. Both of them, at the 1908 London Olympics, won gold medals in track and field and set world records. And then in the early 1920s, at Oregon State, they established a college radio station. Initially it was called KFDJ, later it became KOAC, for Oregon Agricultural College. Now, that radio station grew for a while, and then in 1939, the University of Oregon wanted to get in on the act and also start doing some broadcasting. The problem was they didn't have an antenna. They didn't have a radio station. So what the two schools did was, these are University of Oregon students inside Villard Hall recording a radio show that was then wired to Corvallis to be broadcast from Oregon State's radio station. They continued that for years until eventually KOAC became a TV station. And in the early days of the 1950s, it was thought, well, TV is all the craze. What if we started recording school lectures and broadcasting them, and then students who aren't in the classroom can watch and take notes? We're doing that today here in Lakeview over at the Innovation and Learning Center, the agreement with KCC. Well, this is a group of Oregon students in Villard Hall watching a lecture in Oregon State on a small TV and taking notes. Eventually, University of Oregon did establish its own radio station. They actually built 2 of them. But for the longest time, there was a lot of sharing. Even though there's all this hatred between Oregon and Oregon State, there's a lot of sharing between the two. And then there's this guy that any Oregon fan in the state of Oregon knows who this gentleman is. This is after the 1994 Civil War when Oregon had just won, earning a trip to the Rose Bowl for the first time since 1958. That's Rich Brooks. And in 1977, he was hired as the University of Oregon football coach. And he stayed in Oregon until 1994, at which point he was named the National Coach of the Year and took a job with the St. Louis Rams. He won 21 straight Civil Wars. Now that math may not add up because he coached at Oregon for only 17 years. That's because he was an Oregon State graduate. He played football at Oregon State in the early 70s. Never lost a game as an Oregon State football player. Never lost a game as an Oregon coach to Oregon State until 1988. He lost 1 game in his entire career because they were on their 4th quarterback at that point. Their other 3 quarterbacks have been injured. They were using a freshman wide receiver as their quarterback. That was the one time that Oregon State got the better of Rich Brooks. So both schools throughout history have had shots at the national championship, and neither have actually won the national championship. In the early 20th century, Oregon State was thought of as the best school in the country. Certainly the best school west of the Mississippi. In 1907, they went undefeated and did not give up a single point in a game. Yet they were not granted the national championship that year. A team from the East Coast was given the national championship. You hear a lot about East Coast bias.
Yes.
This is one of the absolute worst cases of East Coast bias, where you're Oregon State not getting the national championship in 1907. Now, it took a lot longer for Oregon to get involved in the national conversation on it. It took until a coach from the East Coast, a fast-talking guy who's kind of weird and quirky, came out to Oregon, and for 4 years coached the Oregon Ducks, led them to the national championship game, totally revolutionized the game of football. Everyone tried to emulate him, and then he left to take a job in Philadelphia, and Oregon's never been the same again. You'd think I'm talking about Chip Kelly, but actually I'm talking about a guy named Hugo Bezdek. In 1913, he left Chicago, and he was an assistant coach under Pop Warner, the Pop Warner, to come to the University of Oregon and take over the Oregon Webfoots program. And over the 4 years, he completely revolutionized not just Oregon, but the way that football is coached and the way it is played. To this day, lessons that Coach Bezdek established at the University of Oregon are still used by coaches. And in 1917, he led Oregon in what was called the East-West Tournament game. Now it's known as the Rose Bowl. The Rose Bowl is commonly referred to as the granddaddy of them all. That's because it was the very first bowl game. And then the third one, it was Oregon who played Penn. And Penn, being the East Coast team, everyone automatically thought Oregon has no chance, and Oregon creamed them. Oregon should have won the national championship that year. It was the only bowl game, but they gave it instead to the University of Pittsburgh. The following year, the U.S. entered World War I, and Coach Bezdek was asked to coach the United States Marine Corps football team. A lot of his Oregon players enlisted in the Marine Corps, so he ended up coaching half the Oregon football team under the auspices of being the United States Marine Corps. Then that following year, the Marine Corps team ended up playing in the East-West tournament game and won. So he won back-to-back times. He's the only coach in history to have won a bowl game with two different, or to have won the Rose Bowl, as it became known, with 2 different teams. He actually went 3 times because he left Oregon after 1918 and took a job in Philadelphia with a professional team. Sounds like Chip Kelly, right? He took over the Philadelphia Athletics, the Major League Baseball team, now the Oakland Athletics. He then became the athletic director at Penn State, and he took Penn State to the Rose Bowl. He's the only person to take 3 different schools to the Rose Bowl, only person to win it with 2 different schools. And he closed out his career by coaching the Cleveland Browns, which means he's the only person in history to coach a Major League Baseball team and an NFL team. So after Hugo, on came this guy, and everyone said Chip Kelly is this crazy scientist and he's this weird genius of football. There's never been anyone like him, but the parallels are crazy. I'm convinced that Chip Kelly is the clone, or the reincarnated version of Hugo Bezdek a century later. They were both from the East Coast. They both coached at Oregon for 4 years. They both led Oregon to a national champion as a national champion contender. And in both cases, as soon as they left, everyone said, Oregon's never going to be as good as they were under Hugo Bezdek or under Chip Kelly. Twice Oregon has got a national championship game. They haven't won, though they should have won in 1917 because they won the game, just like in 1907, Oregon State should have won the national championship. The teams have had shots again. 1956, 1957, back-to-back years, Oregon State went to the Rose Bowl. The following year, 1958, Oregon went to the Rose Bowl. But it really wasn't until the early 2000s that both schools got into national championship conversation. The closest Oregon State has come is 2000. Anyone remembers the 2000 Civil War and when they absolutely destroyed Notre Dame in the Fiesta Bowl? Oregon State finished in the top 5. Oregon, the following year, 2001, finished number 2 in the country. They should have played the national championship game. In the last couple of years, Oregon has had their shot at the national championship as well. So the Civil War game. We'll get into why it's called the Civil War. It's kind of weird that Oregon being as far away from the North versus South battle in the 1860s as you can get, we're called the Civil War. There's been a lot of crazy events that have happened at the Civil War over the years on the field. Very first game was in 1894. Oregon State won that. Again, chalk one up for the Beavers. 1896 was the bad blood where it started, and it's really never relented since. And that was actually between Oregon State and the referees. There was a call at the goal line that the referees, Oregon State, thought they got it wrong, and one Oregon State player started wildly swinging and punching the referee. That call ended up winning the game for Oregon 2-0. In 1910, the game was played in Corvallis. Oregon won in Corvallis, and amidst the post-game celebrations, a brawl started, which quickly turned into a full-scale riot on the field. That riot continued from the football field all the way over to the train station and did not end until every single Oregon fan got on a train and got out of Corvallis. Then, because of that incident, the game was not played in 1911 because it was thought to be too dangerous to hold the game. So in 1912, they started playing it again, but only if it was at a neutral field. So the next several years, they played the game in Albany. So they thought that was the halfway point between Eugene and Corvallis. And they would only play the games with almost the entire police forces from Eugene and Corvallis both there to try to keep things safe on the field. In 1927, several Oregon State students unsuccessfully tried to tear down Oregon's goalposts after the game, and a fight broke out on the field. 1934, a fight broke out in the second quarter between both teams, and actually fans got involved in that fight. So it took about 20 minutes to break it up. In 1937, that's a special story I'm going to save for later, but what instigated it, Oregon had just installed brand new turf at Hayward Field. All those years they've been playing on dirt. And the students had fundraised for months to try to get turf installed at Hayward Field. They did for the Civil War game. They're going to debut it. The night before the game, some Oregon State students came out and burned OSC into the grass. 1940, Oregon won at Oregon State, and some Beta Theta Pi brothers decided to tear down the Oregon State goalposts and drive them all the way back to Eugene. Here they are parading them around Mac Court at a post-game celebration dance. That's Oregon State's goalposts right there. And in 1946, during the game, is when the only time this happened, Puddles the Duck was held hostage by Oregon State fans in the stands at Hayward Field. Some more ones throughout history. One of the most fascinating games happened in 1969. The score was tied 7-7 with only a couple seconds left in the game. Oregon State tried to kick a field goal. It was blocked. The ball somehow hit a referee and bounced off the referee, hit an Oregon player, and rolled down to the goal line where Oregon State recovered it and kicked a field goal to win 10-7. In 1972, there was still 3 minutes left on the clock in Corvallis, with Oregon ahead 30-3 when Oregon fans decided to storm the field and tear down one of the goalposts. They successfully tore down the goalpost. When the game ended, they tried to tear down the other goalposts. Well, a bunch of Oregon State fans ran out on the field, and a gigantic brawl started out on the field. It took minutes to clear. In 1978, there was a really bad, blatant hit to the head that knocked out Oregon State's quarterback, and it led to an Oregon victory. 1983, this is one of my earliest memories in life. It's called the Toilet Bowl, the single worst game in college football history. It was played in Eugene in pouring rain. The game ended in a 0-0 tie. It's the last game in college football history that was ever a 0-0 tie. It had 5 interceptions, 11 fumbles, and 4 missed field goals. And at the end of it, the Oregon State players carried their coach out off the field on their shoulders, acting like they had just won a game. All the Oregon players standing there going, it was a tie. We're just cold. What are we celebrating for? 2000, there was actually a fight that broke out between the mascots during the game, out in the middle of the field. And I also remember a game in the late 80s or early 90s that I was at Autzen Stadium where the mascots exchanged heads for about a quarter. And they were running around the field. The duck had a beaver head on, the beaver had a duck head on. And in 2010, the game was played in Corvallis. I'm happy to say I was there. Oregon won, and it earned their first official trip to the national championship. One stupid fan decided to light a t-shirt on fire. then dropped that on the field, and it caused several $1,000s of damage to Oregon State's field. Burned up the turf. Now, that's just the stuff that's happened on the field. I think the stuff that's happened off the field is far more fascinating. Just a few things, because there's a whole history of this stuff. But in 1954, there were a group of about 50 Oregon students that decided to travel up to Corvallis during homecoming week, and in the middle of the night, both schools used to have giant bonfires as part of their homecoming celebrations, and the freshmen had to guard the wood. Oregon State students didn't do a very good job because the Oregon students set their bonfire, they ignited their bonfire prematurely. Some of them were captured by Oregon State students, had their heads shaved, were forced to do manual labor around campus. One of them had to wear a big sandwich sign and walk through downtown Corvallis that said, "I'm a dumb duck." In 1955, some Oregon State students were captured, had their heads shaved, and were forced to do manual labor on the University of Oregon campus. That also happened in 1957. They didn't have their heads completely shaved, they had their heads shaved into an O to represent the University of Oregon. 1957, this was actually retaliation. We'll get back into why in just a minute. The Oregon State Royal Court was kidnapped and held captive overnight. I don't know how well that would fly today, but back then it was thought it was just college fun. Some Oregon students posed as reporters and went up during homecoming week to interview the Royal Court, and then quickly escorted them into a car and drove them out of town in Corvallis. They took them over to one of their parents' houses, and the girls stayed at that house overnight, treated very nicely, and they were eventually released the next day. That happened again in 1960. Just the homecoming queen was abducted, held for half an hour, and a ransom note was sent to the Oregon State student president, Dick Seidemann, demanding that he ride through the University of Oregon campus in Eugene on a kid's scooter and plead for her return. So I talked about Skinner's Butte. This is the observatory that was built in the 1890s that was blown up with dynamite in 1905. It had these slats that would open up so that they could observe the night sky. Well, after it was blown up on the hillside, in 1908, the university established something called University Day, where once a year, the University of Oregon lets all students out of class, and instead they do work to try to beautify campus. So they would build sidewalks, or they'd plant trees, or one year in 1908, they decided to construct a giant concrete O out of some of the remnants of that observatory. Quickly, it became a site of freshman initiation. They would paint the O yellow every year. So there's the O being painted, and freshmen were responsible for painting it. But they weren't using brushes. They would cover their pants with paint and force them to slide down the O. So that's them sliding down the O right there. Now, the O became a target over the years, and it's fascinating how symbols, fans love symbols and symbolic things. We have a giant L up on the hillside over here. I've only been in town for a year and a half. I don't know if that thing's ever been under assault by rival teams, but the Oregon O has been under constant assault for an entire century. It started in 1910, not Oregon State, but Cal, their baseball team, came to Eugene, and overnight they painted part of the O black to make it a giant C on the hillside. In 1929 was kind of when the trouble started. Some Oregon State students decided they were going to blow up the O with dynamite. I guess following the University of Oregon, they beat them to it in 1905. But they were going to try dynamite on the hill on Skinner's Butte. That's kind of been a recurring theme with dynamite on Skinner's Butte. Some Oregon State students decided to blow up the O with dynamite. They sent a 25-pound chunk of concrete flying several hundred yards away from Skinner's Butte. It came crashing through the roof of a house nearby. Thankfully, no one was hurt. In 1942, once again, they tried to dynamite the O, and they blew away a corner of it. 1947, some Oregon State students were arrested for vandalism. They went up on the hillside because they saw that a bunch of new wires had been set up. The University of Oregon had just established their own radio station. Remember how before Oregon was using Oregon State's radio station? They just built the Oregon radio station, and they wanted to destroy the Oregon radio station, take those ducks down. So they cut down a bunch of guy wires. The problem was they were cutting down the police radio antennas, not the college radio station. So they were quickly arrested. 1952 was a fascinating one. Once again, dynamite was brought to Skinner's Butte by some Oregon State fans, determined to get rid of the O. They decided to blow it up in the middle of the night around 4 a.m., and it just happened to coincide. 1952, remember, the Red Scare. Everyone thought the communists were coming, Russia's going to come bomb us. a large airplane just happened to pass overhead in Eugene that woke up the town, made a lot of noise. And shortly after that, a gigantic explosion woke up the entire town on top of Skinner's Butte. And immediately people were calling left and right thinking that the Russians were bombing the Willamette Valley, that nuclear bombs are being dropped. Well, the police couldn't respond because the dynamite they just set off destroyed the police radio antennas on Skinner's Butte once again. So there was this paranoia in town almost all day long, thinking that did the Russians bomb us? Is everyone okay? No, it was just Oregon State students once again using dynamite on Skinner's Butte, trying to get rid of the O. At that point, people in town had had it. They're like, why do we have this O? Oregon State, and I'm not even mentioning the fact that it had been painted orange at least 100 times at this point. Freshmen were supposed to guard the O overnight during homecoming week. It probably had maybe 100 different layers of orange on top of yellow, on top of orange, on top of yellow, on top of orange, on top of yellow. And so they said, we got to get rid of this thing. It's a target. It's too attractive. Oregon State students want to get rid of it. They ended up replacing the original O. Of all the dynamite that was used, it couldn't get rid of the O. What got rid of the O was jackhammers wielded by Oregon students. Instead, they decided to build a wooden O in 1953. Well, what happens with wood? So, 1953, even with the wooden O, Oregon State, now I don't know what it is, why does Oregon State have so much access to dynamite?
Engineers.
Engineering, exactly. So they were borrowing dynamite from the engineering department. That was University of Oregon's engineering department to use on Skinner's Butte to try to get rid of this O. So they tried to dynamite the wooden O. Well, that didn't do a whole lot of good. All it did was send a bunch of dirt everywhere. But by this point, the community was so tired of it, the mayor said, we don't want the O obliterated, but we must face the realistic problem of pacifying the citizenry. Well, the original O was demolished. They built the wooden O, and that became a problem for the students because they still wanted to keep the sliding down, painting the O tradition. But they got a lot of splinters now, and so that tradition kind of died off. In 1955, the O was dynamited yet again. Very little damage though. And in 1957, Oregon State finally got smart. They realized, well, this thing's wooden. Why are we trying to blow it up? Let's just take it apart. So they just disassembled it and drove the entire O back to Corvallis. Now they disassembled it, took it back to Corvallis, and the following day, the Oregon State Dean of Men, Dan Poling, confirmed that indeed the O had taken up residency in Corvallis. And he sent a proposal saying, why don't we make the O an official trophy, where whoever wins the Civil War that year gets to keep the O, and it'll be painted in school colors. Well, Oregon students didn't like that. That was their O. So their retaliation was that they kidnapped the homecoming royal court in 1957 and said, we'll return the royal court when you return our O. That ended up working. They released the royal court, and eventually in 1958 the wooden O was returned to the University of Oregon. But at that point, the students decided to burn it. They said, it's sat in Corvallis too long. It's tainted. We can't have this anymore. It's been in Corvallis. Ooh, bad. So the O was returned, and instead they made it out of steel plates on reinforced concrete that sits about 3 feet off the ground. And they also moved it down the hill, thinking, they planted trees and thought, it's out of sight, out of mind. Lots of people don't even know that the O is on the hill now because it's kind of blocked by trees. They thought, it's out of sight more, Oregon State people will finally leave it alone. Well, they didn't. They kept trying to paint it over and over again. And eventually, they used blowtorches to disassemble the O and take it back to Corvallis. So they took it back. It sat in Corvallis for a little while, and eventually it was returned piece by piece and reassembled. And that O is what still stands to this day. Here's an article from the Eugene Register Guard talking about how the missing O might become kindling wood up in Corvallis. Once that new steel O was installed, the tradition of sliding down the O for freshmen lasts only about a year because now it's several feet off the ground, and it was quite a safety hazard to try to actually stay on the O without falling off and injuring yourself. 1962 is when they tried to disassemble with blowtorches. 1969 was the last time that there was an attempted dynamite explosion of the O. Somehow, amidst all of this dynamite, the O has persevered, and 2009 was the last time that it's been painted orange. Most students today don't even know that it's there anymore. So that's the Oregon O, but the O is one of the most fascinating places, but the Civil War games, they're always fun, but there was one year when it got out of hand, and that was 1937. And this is the year where the Civil War got its name. It started, like I had mentioned before, Oregon had fundraised for months to install brand new grass at Hayward Field. And the night before the game, some Oregon State students came out and burned O into their brand new turf that had cost thousands of dollars that they had just fundraised forever to try to get installed. 1937 was a huge deal. They brought in world famous swing jazz band led by Paul Whiteman to perform at a homecoming dance before the game. There was an international opera star, Emilietta Galli-Circe, I hope I'm saying that right, that traveled into Eugene, and she was the guest of honor at the game. It was the largest crowd to ever watch a Oregon State game up to that time. But soon the chaos started, even before the game. This is University of Oregon cheerleaders parading a cow on the back of a truck and insinuating to all the Oregon State fans that they had kidnapped their girlfriend. So there was a lot of bad blood going on even before the game. In retaliation to the rather insulting thing of suggesting that this large cow was the Oregon State's girlfriend, Oregon State students once again captured Puddles and held Puddles for ransom for most of the game on the opposite sideline. Here's a shot from that 1937 game, and as the game was playing out, in the final minute, Oregon State was winning, and they went on to win 14-0. And the game was off in one corner of the field, and Oregon State was just right at the clock, and a bunch of Oregon State students decided to run on the field and tear down the goalposts at Hayward Field. So they started trying to tear them down. Well, the Oregon students were going to have that, so they ran onto the field, and soon a huge brawl started in the end zone. There was one Oregon State student who managed to climb up the goalpost and was standing on the goalpost. Oregon students were yanking at him, and they pulled his pants off. So in front of the largest crowd in Civil War history up to that time, this guy exposed himself in front of thousands of people, standing on top of the goalpost. Despite the fight that started, eventually the goalpost did come down, and the Oregon State students carried them through Eugene, parading in celebration, and getting pummeled with water balloons and garbage and vegetables and anything that Oregon fans could throw at them, until eventually they left for Corvallis in celebration. Except that wasn't the end of it. 2 days later, Monday morning, Oregon State students think, you know what, we need to celebrate our win in the Civil War more. So a bunch of students decided to skip class, climb onto cars. Some were as many as 15 kids on cars. And they had this huge caravan of several thousand students head from Corvallis and drive down to Eugene to celebrate on the University of Oregon campus their victory from 2 days prior. Well, as they drove by Junction City, there was a store owner who noticed that there's a whole bunch of cars with kids strapped to the top of them heading towards Eugene. So he called ahead and said, just so you know, there's a bunch of Oregon students headed your way. You might want to prepare for it. So the police were warned, and the school administration was warned about it. And so when the Oregon State students arrived, there was the University of Oregon marching band playing the Oregon State fight song, and the Oregon president welcoming them to Eugene and congratulating them on their win. The Eugene police were there too and agreed to escort them through town so that they could have a little mini parade. For some reason, they like to wave corn stalks in celebration. So here's some students on board by, I guess that's a Model T or Model A, waving corn stalks at Oregon students. And that was all well and good. Most of the students, once their little mini parade through campus was over, most of them left town. But several hundred decided to hang around and really stick it to the Ducks some more. So there were some incidents that happened on campus. These are some University of Oregon students that had set up a fire hose that were spraying water onto Oregon State students passing by. There was also a lot of garbage thrown, a lot of water balloons, and eventually, right around lunchtime, a brawl broke out on campus between the Oregon State students over there. It was right over by Gerlinger Hall on campus, and that fight lasted for several minutes, and after being pretty bloody, those Oregon State students decided, let's go grab lunch. So they went into Eugene and went to a place called Seymour's Cafe. Well, as classes got out from the University of Oregon, word spread quickly. Hey, there's some Beavers here, and they just started a bunch of trouble. And they're at Seymour's Cafe in downtown Eugene. Let's go get them. So very quickly, Seymour's Cafe was surrounded by several thousand University of Oregon students, with a couple hundred Oregon State students inside that barricaded themselves inside. Eventually, the restaurant owner said, "Get out of my store," and they left and were quickly rounded up. The Eugene police had offered to escort the students before, but at this time, they kind of just, you know, they turned their heads and said, you know what, these kids deserve whatever they're going to get for hanging around. So they were very quickly rounded up, held, their cars were overturned in the streets. and they were carried off to the mill race. And I mentioned before where Puddles was first on. They were all thrown into the river. Then they were dragged out of the river, and they had their heads shaved, and they were marched up to the top of Skinner's Butte to the Oregon O. And they, just like all the freshmen, they were stripped down and forced to paint the O. And it was only after they'd been thrown in the river, had their heads shaved, and painted the O that then the police showed up and said, you know what, it's probably time that you got out of town, so go ahead and leave. The next day, the Eugene Register Guard's headline was, OSC invades Eugene, war follows. And ever since that 1937 riot and this headline, the Oregon State battle, which is going to occur for the 119th time next Friday, has been known as the Civil War.
Okay.
I wanted to show some videos that embedded into that. Unfortunately, like I said, my video wasn't working right, but I have a video here that was done about Benny the Beaver.
I'm Ken Austin, Oregon State's first Benny Beaver, back in 1952, and I just had a wonderful time learning how to act in front of crowds and entertain the crowds, and I'm just proud that the history still goes on. In the spring of 1952, right over here at Gill Coliseum, we met at the athletic director's office. A bunch of us turned out for the rally squad. A fraternity brother was going to do it, and I thought it would be fun to do it with him. He won the selection, and on the way back to the fraternity house, said, you know why I won? And I said, no. And he said, because I propose that we have a student mascot. And I'd like for you to be a student mascot. And I said, what the heck is a student mascot? And in that picture that we held up this afternoon, that's Bill Sundstrom standing in the background, and he was the one that had the proposal for a student mascot. But I bought a costume head at a costume shop, decorated it with shag rug, made the tail out of a big piece of sponge rubber, wore football pants and a football jersey. I think it was a football jersey. In high school, I was Kenny Austin. And I think maybe after a few beers with Bill, I might have said, you know, why don't we call him Benny? Because I was called Kenny. But who knows? The school has done wonderful things for me. I had no idea what my life would be like if I hadn't been Benny. It gave me self-confidence. But I'm awfully proud of my school. I love you, Benny.
So after tonight, I hope you've learned a lot more about your school, whichever one you decide to follow, Oregon State. Whoever wins next week, the most fun part of the Civil War is getting into the arguments with fellow fans about this and that. And there is nothing more fun about being able to educate opposing fans about their own team. So, Oregon Duck fans, you now know that Oregon State is not little brother, because they're the older school, they're the larger school. Beaver fans, you know that the current Oregon mascot is not named Puddles, it's the Duck. Puddles was the mascot they had from 1920 and into the 1940s. And Duck fans, you know to be very, very nice to our Beaver brethren, because they have huge amounts of dynamite readily available. And are perfectly willing to use it. So enjoy the Civil War. Kickoff is 12:30 p.m. next Friday. So that's it. Any questions or anything else that you want me to cover?
I was just going to say, Kirk, Hannah O'Leary, probably maybe a sister
Yes.
of his, the photographer that does most of the pictures in the Oregon State quarterly magazine, the Oregon State, another Lake County,
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting to find the ties. No, I grew up in Oregon and Eugene, and both my parents being school teachers, I traveled all over the state because we got summers off. My parents had been in the U.S. Forest Service, so we did lots of camping trips. I thought I'd been all over Oregon. Like 99% of Oregonians, I've never been south of Bandon East Great Lake. So when I heard about a job opportunity in Lakeview, I thought it was around Portland. I had to look up on a map. Where's Lakeview? And yet, Lake County has had this tremendous impact in both schools, even though they're hours and hours away. It's fascinating to me that such a large state of square mileage has the two schools side by side, and yet they represent our entire state. And they're so close to each other, and you couldn't find more polar opposites. And yet, amidst all the family ties, we saw brothers and cousins that have played on both sides. There's families that are split on both sides. And the two schools, even though they're tremendous rivals, and they're known as one of the most bigger rivals in the world, they've had all these shared experiences. They've shared programs. They've shared radio airwaves. They've tried to blow up their own. All sorts of things that have gone on side by side between the two schools. Yes?
I was wondering, I don't know if you remember, Ray, but Chuck Shelton, he played in the Rose Bowl, right?
Yeah, the University of Oregon.
Oh, it wasn't University of Oregon State.
I can't remember.
Do you guys remember Chuck Shelton?
Oh, yeah, he's a good friend of mine.
But he was in the Rose Bowl
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
from Oregon State, whatever year.
That would have been, Oregon played in 1958 and they lost to Ohio State 10-7. Oregon State won in 1956 and lost in 1957. So there was a three-year streak where both Oregon schools played in the Rose Bowl.
And the other thing, Roseberry, I think they have your name switched. I think it's Lane that's at the University of Oregon.
You know what? You are correct on that. My apologies. Christian is the one at George Fox University.
Yeah.
Lane Roseberry is the one who's playing at the University of Oregon. My apologies on that.
Oh, no, it's just
Another football trivia, and I don't remember which year it was, maybe 96 or 98, when it was at Oregon State, and they tore down the goalposts, one of the goalposts, and there was a person injured in it.
Yes, there was.
And that person that was injured is the daughter of
Carla, yeah.
from Lakeview. Their daughter was one that was hurt in that, and they tore down the goalpost.
The goalposts have been a target almost as much as the O on Skinner's View. The goalposts have been a target, or at least a source of instigation for
So does Oregon State not have an equivalent? Like an OSU?
Oregon State does not really have an equivalent to the Oregon O in terms of a symbol that has been under all-out assault. Both campuses, as with any university, they have certain symbols. There was actually a trophy between both schools called the Platypus Trophy that was passed, even though they had mentioned that the Oregon wooden O should be a trophy. They had a smaller wooden O that no one really cared about, and it ended up being thrown in a locker and forgotten about in Mac Court on the University of Oregon campus for decades. It was only a couple of years ago they randomly found this thing and realized, oh, it's the Platypus Trophy. It's not been used since the 1960s or so. For a while there was a trophy that got passed back and forth. In terms of symbols, I'm not aware of one on the Oregon State campus that has been attacked. Beyond the goalposts have been attacked a whole bunch by Oregon students. And there's been little things here and there that have occurred. Typical college hijinks that always happens. But in terms of a symbol between the two schools, nothing beats the O on Skinner's View in terms of something that has been the all-out assault. It's been painted at least 100 times orange, then painted back to yellow. It's been blown up with dynamite. I lost track of how many times I counted that it's been blown up with dynamite, but certainly a lot of, although engineering students, do you think they know how to use dynamite better? Really all they did was tear up the hillside over and over again. Anything else you want me to cover? Or I realize I could talk about this for hours and hours on end, but I didn't want to let everyone get home at a somewhat decent hour. So I appreciate everyone listening and enjoy the game.
Thank you.